Hello and welcome to Viewpoints. My name is Tom Ballant, and I'm here with Michael Brown of the TSA, winner of the Outstanding Thesis Award for his thesis, Freed, Ripples of the Convicted and Released Terrorists in America. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
It's an interesting title for your thesis. How did you come up with the subject?
Well, the subject of my thesis is a very personal one, Tom. I lost my father from a terrorist attack in 1985 over in Spain, and following the terrorism continuum through its entire duration as a student, first thinking about the planning of an attack, the ripple effects that come from that attack, and even further down that line, what happens when an individual who's convicted of a terrorism-related crime, what happens when he gets out of prison? And that subject has not really been part of the terrorism or even Homeland Security narrative, as we've really only been talking about the subject of terrorism for 10 years here in the States, despite attacks against American interests going back longer than 10 years.
So I guess we haven't had many convictions of terrorists here in America.
Well, since 2001, the Justice Department has shown that there have been more than 400 convictions of terrorism-related crimes in the United States. I took a subset of that population, about 170 of those individuals, which came from a study from Human Rights First, to examine what the ripple effects were for those who have done time in prison and for those who have subsequently been released.
What do you mean by ripple effects?
It's an interesting question. In fact, I struggled with defining what a ripple effect is. When an individual gets out of prison, I believed that there would be some type of consequence societally. I think that victims' families would be upset to know that a convicted terrorist was released from prison, that politicians would be uncomfortable with the release of a convicted terrorist from prison. Any other stakeholder that may not yet be defined upon getting the news of the release of a convicted terrorist would have some concern. So while not having a concrete definition of what a ripple effect was, I thought that there was some type of spectrum through which I could identify what happens when a convicted terrorist is released from prison. So we do see this, for example, with common criminals, when a convicted murderer maybe does time in prison, or a convicted individual for manslaughter gets released from prison. What happens when he gets out? What are the headlines that come up? And I was looking to apply those types of questions for convicted terrorists.
And what did you find out?
Interestingly, I was not able to identify the location of any of these convicted terrorists upon their release from prison, which the non-finding by itself actually introduced some findings, that the public doesn't know much about convicted and released terrorists, convicted terrorists leaving prisons, that we don't know if they present a threat, and should we care? Or should they be treated like any other criminal as our justice system treats them?
Did you look at how it's treated in other countries too?
I did. There are places where convicted terrorists are released from prison, including Indonesia, in Singapore, and there are programs that are out there to help either the rehabilitation of terrorists, either to restrict their movement. There are many different consequences that come from the release of a convicted terrorist that I've seen overseas, anywhere from Australia to France, but we really haven't seen it here.
So what should we do with the terrorists when they get out of jail?
Well, this is the beginning of our dialogue. There are a couple of different options. One is to maintain the status quo. Right now, if they're getting out of prison and they're not making an impact, as my findings showed, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that silence means that they are back in with society and we don't have reason for concern. Another option, maybe it is to do some type of risk assessment before they leave prison to determine if they present a risk to society. Another option would be to monitor these individuals. We monitor sex offenders upon their release from prison by having registries and letting the public know that there might be concerns in their respective community. And then another option would be to lengthen the detainment of these individuals because of that continued threat.
So I imagine the constitutional lawyers would have some problems with extending the sentences of already convicted individuals.
Lawyers and other stakeholders would have concerns about extending detention. In fact, all of the options that I just mentioned have unanticipated consequences and need to be considered before going forward. In fact, my thesis does not have the one silver bullet type of a response or answer as far as what we should do when a convicted terrorist is released from prison. This is a new narrative. It's an emerging discussion, which, even if it's not emerging, the intention of my thesis is to bring this to the forefront of dialogue here in the United States, because it's something that we can plan for, knowing when somebody's going to get out of prison. And this is not necessarily resting solely with government either. It takes a mega community approach of government, business, civil society, academia, scholars, all different types of individuals who might be impacted or might contribute to that ongoing narrative.
So what are the next steps? Does your thesis identify where we need to go?
The thesis lays out those 4 possible options as far as where we go, whether that is maintain the status quo, lengthen detainment, do risk assessments, or introduce monitoring. So what we do from here is we take that mega community approach and we market the thesis, and we say, listen, to folks on Capitol Hill, to folks in the private sector community, to universities, to prisons, and all those respective stakeholders that might touch a convicted and released terrorist.
Does your thesis leave open some areas that are going to need to be researched in the future?
Absolutely. In the fields of social work, terrorism studies, victimology, psychology, sociology, this thesis is interdisciplinary and requires a collaborative approach to determine what the best solution may be for the United States. And it's not something that's going to be solved quickly. It's going to take ongoing narrative, ongoing dialogue with a number of decision makers to assess the pertinence of it in the Homeland Security discussion.
Well, I imagine as we continue to have dialogue about closing Guantanamo Bay and trying terrorists here in America, the relevance is going to become more and more apparent.
Guantanamo Bay, in fact, is one subject that has overlapped with this a little bit, but I draw one distinction. Guantanamo Bay detainees have not been convicted of a terrorism-related crime. These are individuals who have already been captured, convicted, and they're released into American society with the feeling that their sentence was enough. And therefore, it's important that this population gets its own unique attention as the Guantanamo Bay gets solved in its own unique way as well.
Well, congratulations on your award-winning thesis. Certainly it's a timely topic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tom.